back at in a year. So think of this, I would say, as a brainstorming session and the beginning of a process. So that having been said, energy, you're on. Dun, 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 dun. Well, introduce yourself and then talk about what you think the takeaways are. Do we have a mic?
You have a little while you're here. Why don't you put on the loudspeaker? Good, that's good. And then you can work from that.
Oh, you want to do that? Work on the podium? Sure.
So I'm probably not going to take many minutes. So the energy sector had a long discussion. We came up with a whole, I'm sorry?
Introduce.
Oh, my name is Austin Brandt. Worked for the Cape Light Compact and was part of the energy sector table. So the energy sector table had a long discussion, came up with a lot of ideas, and we had to eventually spend a lot of time narrowing them down to these 5 that we have up here. So I'll just run through them real quick and the ideas behind them. The first being, and these aren't necessarily in order of priority. So the first being supporting the Home Energy Scorecards initiative. So right now there's been some legislation proposed in past sessions to require homes before they are sold to get a home energy assessment through the Mass Save programs so that future homeowners know how energy efficient the home is. It's met a lot of pushback at the state legislature. And so one of the things that this group decided was that is actually a really wise move as long as we also, and I failed to write this up there, educate realtors about energy efficiency and the value that that can add to the home. So that was one of our top item. The second one is develop community-based finance mechanisms for renewable energy. I'm not a finance mind, so I'm not going to pretend I understand it, but the group discussion was around the model from SAMHSA about how people could buy shares in renewable energy projects and therefore help get them off the ground and running. And we'd like to explore that here, perhaps in partnership with local lending institutions to make those projects happen and really bring local finances to the table in supporting renewable energy. The third is a little more specific, and it's supporting community empowerment legislation. I don't know how many of you know about that or not, but it essentially allows, through a contract for differences mechanism, towns to vote through democratic process to help finance large-scale renewable energy projects and essentially purchase the energy from them. I don't want to get into the details because I'm not the expert on it. That also has met a lot of resistance at the state legislature, but the table as a whole felt that that was one way that communities could enable communities to directly support renewable energy projects that they want to support. The fourth is the supporting advanced metering deployment. This was part of grid modernization that's been going on at the DPU. Advanced metering is really foundational to using not necessarily less energy, but using energy in a smarter way, reducing our peak demand, being able to absorb renewable energy when it's producing through creative pricing, enabling customers to have a financial motivation to determine when and how they're using their energy. And instead of offering only a fixed price option, but where it doesn't matter when you turn on your dryer, your dishwasher, your clothes washer, being able to mitigate those peaks and reduce costs across the board will be really important. And advanced metering infrastructure is foundational to that. It can't happen without AMI. And the third is encouraging consumer purchase of renewable energy. We had a lot of discussion about this topic, and at the end of the day, there's a free market for electricity in Massachusetts. It was supposed to be one of the benefits of the Restructuring Act. And there are a lot of different electricity products out there. Many of them are offering renewables above the state mandate. So the more that we can encourage customers to use their power of choice and actually take advantage of that market for the purposes of supporting renewable energy, the better. And so we felt that was important to include.
Okay, is that it? Now you're going to watch me walk up to a microphone and get incredible feedback. I've been doing this long enough to know that. And that was only 4 minutes. Let me just, one other thing, because I have a little editorial license. As far as through the trees a little bit, one of the things that's going on right now in the State House is we are putting the investors of utilities that are maintaining aging infrastructures ahead of the interests of the environment and our ratepayers and our citizens. So one of the things I would say to energy from the public policy side is how do we break that? One of the great things about SAMHSA that you heard is the linkage between the ownership model and the outcome of where we want to be. So connecting long-term policy to ownership structures that actually don't benefit short-term status quo, but benefit long-term vision. And I think, I know that's embedded in here, but because you're all energy people, sometimes there's a forest and a trees issue. Sarah, transportation, come on up. Where's Sarah?
Right next to you.
Oh my God.
That was a nice segue into a couple of things, controversial things that we discussed today, which actually I'm going to share with you.
You got to introduce yourself.
I'm Sarah Griscom. I work for the town of Chatham, and I also work for Pleasant Bay Community Boating as the science program director. And we were just given a floating classroom that's electric and solar powered. Thank you. It's amazing. So we talked about the 5 modes of transport. You've got vehicles, which include RTA, delivery vehicles, cars, school buses. Then you have trains, you have planes, you have ferries, and you have bicycles. So those, we talked about those sort of, and we went around in circles. One important thing came out, well, we didn't follow the rules and just write our goals down, but these really were our goals. We're going to have more meetings, and we talked about meeting quarterly. That could be through a conference call because of our distant locations. We're going to have a legislative group that's going to deal with changing problems with the legislature and getting more buy-in to renewable energy and to support transportation changes, the big changes that need to be made. And then there's an infrastructure group to talk about what exactly are those changes, what kind of infrastructure do we need to promote for these different modes. So getting back to our conversation, Eversource, I think it's pretty clear they have a monopoly. And one thing was we were talking about breaking down that monopoly and having municipal energy centers. So that was that's kind of a big ask, but that's going to be something that I think would really help us promote all the changes that we need to do here on the Cape. What else? Let's see. Okay, so most of the people sitting at the table were probably over 50 or 60 in ways. One young person. And so I went on and waxed on about how my new Bolt is so awesome and I love it and I want everybody to buy a Bolt. And he said, no, we want to get people out of cars. And that was RTA, oh gosh, your name? Tom King. Get people out of their cars. And this is a generational thing, definitely. So I think as the elders are trying to promote change, we need to recognize that it's a cultural change and we need to promote things that we're not necessarily comfortable with. So those are the bicycles, and in particular electrified bicycles. So what types of things that could promote is affordable tourism on the Cape. So you could take your bikes, bring them down to Hyannis, connect up the rail trails so you can have access to the whole Cape, have affordable camping, perhaps dormitory types of things. But anyways, make Cape Cod a young person's destination, and not continue to pack it with seniors. Is that fair to say? Am I done?
If you want to be.
Okay, so car-free tourism, and we're going to meet and talk more about this.
And to Max's point when he gave his great presentation, if you remember the pie chart, what 33% is transportation. So Tom Kerr, who is the incredibly gifted director at the RTA here on the Cape, who was Undersecretary of Transportation for the Commonwealth under, I think, both administrations, right, Democratic and Republican, has agreed to convene a working group around transportation. Well, we're actually going to get together and drill down. So, and seeing Tom do that, bring together ferry people and train people and airplane people, and really start to talk about intermodal opportunities around the lowest hanging fruit to reduce that 33%. So we're looking forward to that, Tom. Why are you nodding your head and shaking your head?
No.
Yep. He's on board. Education. He knew. He volunteered. They write big, so we'll allow that.
So I can read it from here. Good afternoon, I'm Keith Lewison. I was facilitating the education sector. We spent a lot of time, a group of us, several educators from different private, public, and charter schools in the Cape, and a couple of students, which was great to have their input as well. Talking about how to bring students and teachers together to help promote the net zero goals, and what kind of infrastructure we need to build in order to help facilitate that. A lot of that conversation was about some of the challenges we have as teachers, just even meeting up just with each other from different districts and different schools. So we're really grateful that we were able to meet each other here today. So we spent a lot of time brainstorming that, got about 20 things down, and then we boiled it down into 2 goals. Sorry, we didn't get to 3. And some action items under those goals. So first goal.
Create this one, yeah.
Create youth leadership around the net zero
and
climate change on the Cape and Islands, right? So that in order to do that, in order to facilitate that, we discussed the idea of having tentatively named net zero club chapters. And it was very important to us that they not be affiliated with any one school, but rather be on some neutral territory, possibly a local public library, where kids from various schools could then come together with educator adults supporting their efforts. So that's one idea, but to start to build this infrastructure around networking kids together from different schools around the net zero concept. Then to create dialogue, so say hypothetically there were several of these chapters across the Cape, then linking those chapters together, and then ultimately trying to build towards an annual youth summit that would bring kids together once a year from across the Cape on issues of climate change. So that was our first goal. Our second goal was to improve access to resources. There's so many wonderful resources that already exist. We don't need to reinvent the wheel, but often teachers and students aren't familiar with all of them, or they're just so busy that they don't get a chance to see them. So we want to try to create, again, an infrastructure, whether that's a social media or web presence, or list of local speakers and people that could partner with us. That's also some of the nonprofit organizations in the Cape that could help this endeavor. Again, ultimately of empowering our young people to work towards climate action on the Cape, and then supporting our teachers and helping the kids accomplish that. So, thank you.
Next is municipal sector. Who's speaking for that? You got it.
Hi, Jim Hungerford from Orleans Renewable Energy Committee. We didn't know we had to put all of this down on the paper there, so we wrote that real fast, and to be honest, I can't read half of what I wrote, so I'm going to work from this, and I guarantee it says the same thing up there. Number 1 was, and this is not in any particular order here, all Cape and Island towns should become green community towns by October 2020. Now, October, when you're applying for a green community, your ERP, or your energy reduction plan, gets submitted to DOER, which is the Department of Energy Resources, by the end of October. Okay, so that's why, and then they decide, they take a couple of months and decide who's going to become green community towns, and then at some point later on you get a check. Okay, next was encourage the building of solar carports and solar community gardens and other renewable energy projects. This is a way to increase the number of renewable projects within a town. Next is enact community empowerment legislation to allow municipals to act as electricity aggregators. we played with all those words quite a bit, and that's just it's the best that we came up with. Next, expand the green community objectives to include residential and commercial properties besides municipalities. Right now, the 5 criteria to become a green community applies only to municipal properties, okay? So we felt DOER has some very good ideas that we're calling objectives, and we think it would be a good idea to include residential and commercial properties on those objectives. And the last item here is to develop a baseline inventory for Cape and Island towns pertaining to greenhouse gas emissions. And those are our 5.
That's great.
We have 3 more pages worth.
Next, we have advocacy and outreach.
I'm Kristen Andres with the Association of Preserved Cape Cod. The microphone a little bit. So we had lots of great ideas, and we boiled them down to 5 that we think are achievable in at least most of them in the short term. I'll start with number 2 because I think that our first thought is that we really thought a collaborative effort was needed. We have so many environmental groups, so much energy and resources that we think a collaborative network that we could get together and share and communicate about what we're doing and what we can do together to communicate climate change action. So I think that was the foremost important thing. One of the ideas that came up was to reach the general public is to basically give a flyer out with 5 steps that the average person could take to reduce their carbon footprint and distribute them through some public space like a grocery store or someplace that's could easily be distributed to everybody, including our visitors and summer residents. We thought very inspired by the stories we heard today, and in order to reach the business community, a roundtable of businesses to be invited to hear people speak, like representatives of Cape Cod 5 and Cape Air, to talk about actually starting off with why we have a culture, creating a climate change culture in our business, and so why, as business leaders, do they do that, and then also share how. We think that's very inspirational and would help address and reach that audience of businesses on Cape Cod. Oh, and then to track, very important to sort of track our progress. For outreach and advocacy, you want to let the public know that steps are being taken and that there's actually accomplishments being made in achieving our goals. And we're not quite sure. I think that's a big issue to deal with, but it's important to at least have some measure.
Great.
Oh my goodness, how could I forget? Foremost is to help elect political candidates that support efforts in climate change action.
And again, editorializing between, that's not ideologues. We don't need to elect ideologues on either side. As I said before, people who synthesize fact and reality of today into vision of tomorrow, it's pretty easy to identify people who can do that. And they're not ideologues, right? The people who actually can articulate both the today and the tomorrow pretty well. The built environment. Okay. While we're doing that, I do want to do a shout out because Dorothy will not have an opportunity to get up and say the amazing building that is going on, but an example of the environmental build out is the building that Cape Cod 5, I shamelessly will admit I am on the board, so there is a connection. But is building out on Route 132. Everybody should watch that building as it comes together, because that's an example of business community, environmental stewardship, and a company that is and does believe in doing the right thing. So I want that shout out to you. And Bert is here in the back there.
Thank you. My name is Fred Hops, and somebody's getting a call from Steve right now.
I'll answer it. Damn it.
I'm busy. So I'm from the other Cape. I'm from Beverly, and I'm very interested in what 5Cs is doing. So I just want to talk briefly about what our Built workshop talked about. And it was great. Dorothy started us off by talking about what a fantastic building that is. That's an inspiration for, looking at the best practices. But one of the whys we came up with was why are we considered the built environment is so important? And it's because it's using 40% of our carbon emissions. And one of the things, another why for why we should work together is the common exposure we have here on the Cape or on the seashore, like up in Beverly. But you have a serious threat here on the Cape, and that should unite you in a one Cape strategy. And parlay that into a shared commitment to enact into both community and attractiveness to others. So the attractiveness to others was to say, this is a green Cape. This is people who care. This is why you want to come to the Cape. It's like Bernd does in Samsu. It's like an ecotourism, that people come here because you care about the environment, and to make that, to be proud about that. So what are we going to do about that? We're talking about leadership and cultural motivation. Getting commitments from each of the towns to meet our GWSA or Paris Climate Accord targets, to work as one region across fiefdoms. I understand there are some here. And so to develop that sort of regional approach, and that is an environment of conservation and clean energy. And that 5Cs could be the catalyst for that, the leader for that. What a fantastic group that is. I hope to do some of that work up in my region. But to bring people together, to convene a region-wide, a Cape-wide initiative, and be a player in this transformation. And to bring aligned objectives. This is something that Dorothy mentioned. Look at aligned objectives and bring different stakeholders to the table. So when you talk about built environment, you can say mitigation and all the marvelous things. I'm a mass save contractor. There's a lot of money laying on the table out there for us to renovate our existing housing stock. HERS can come up with rating scores for energy efficient mortgages for going forward and incentivizing the market. And then just to wrap up, to look at incentives to get people to want to do that, not just make it a policy. I think the biggest thing was a one Cape approach, and look at stretch code and even passive house criteria for going beyond net zero. So mitigation is important, but also abatement, that you might have to rebuild bridges, you might have to support the dunes, you might have to do other work in this coming catastrophe. So there's a lot in the built environment, but I hope I was able to cover some of that. Thank you.
So I would say, one of the collaborative partners that's so important here on Cape Cod is what is considered to be the leading environmental nonprofit, which is the Association to Preserve Cape Cod. And I actually think the APCC is morphing to the Association to Plan Cape Cod. And Don Karen is here, and we worked so hard when I was in the legislature on zoning reform. One of the things we have to do in the Commonwealth, and it is hard because each town has its own zoning stuff, but we have to regionally identify opportunities around energy and zoning and make sure that that is in whatever, if ever, there is a zoning reform bill that passes, which I'm still optimistic at some point before my great-grandchildren are here and gone that will happen in Massachusetts. What is this one? Faith. Faith. How could I forget? Faith. A great community. One of the things, as we're getting into that, we identified many different communities here. We speak as one community, but we have a faith community that is really strong in the bedrock I always said when I spoke in church, and believe it or not, I was asked once or twice to speak on Sunday. I said, wouldn't it be wonderful if we took what we talk about on Sunday and actually practice it on Monday through Saturday? And that is a really beautiful thought for the faith community, business community, civic community, political community. I mean, that is sort of the four communities that need to interweave. And the faith community is so important and very often under-recognized as far as the importance here. So, thank you.
Well, I ought to stop while I'm ahead. So I'm Paul Myers. I've been for the last year or so the co-chair of the Faith Communities Environmental Network. We started out with 3 congregations initially. We're now up to 17. We've just welcomed the first from the islands, the Congregational Church in West Tisbury on Martha's Vineyard. So as we met today, we were not starting something new, but continuing a conversation. And it was really wonderful for us to have this opportunity to see how we can do better what we've already started doing, and actually to reach out in some fresh ways. Like the other groups, we came up with a whole bunch of possibilities and eventually narrowed it down to 4 major categories with examples in each of those. So one of the, actually, and then we ranked them. The 4 categories will follow in the order of the priority they were given by the folks in the group. First is education, both within our faith communities and using the faith communities to reach out more broadly to the surrounding community. And education about a variety of things. Some big issues like a fresh moral vision to undergird our efforts for a greener future. Some much more practical, like making sure that people know about the wonderful opportunities available for free energy audits, etc. Just a host of other issues under the general category of education. The second broad category was youth. And I think many of us really had our hunches about the importance of this confirmed by what we experience today, both with some of the adults who are educators, but also especially with the young people who've been here. We want to do far more than we have done previously to find fresh, collaborative, intergenerational efforts to reach out the old folks to the new folks, where there's a give and take and a kind of mutual sharing and learning that can and does come with that around environmental issues. We want, thirdly, to seek a buy-in from the wider community beyond the church walls to the surrounding community to push more aggressively for commitments from our surrounding community to take the kinds of changes that will lead us toward the goals that we've articulated today. And finally, the fourth one, environmental justice. We want to be sure that we do everything we can to include traditionally marginalized groups so that they are beneficiaries, as they usually are not, of whatever changes that are made on the way to a green future.
We saw a couple of houses of personal individuals, and Max showed his, Brent shows his. So personal narrative is really good. So I'm just going to give you my personal faith narrative. Okay, you ready for this? Take notes. Born in a Jewish home, 13 years at a Quaker school, married a woman who is Catholic, who practices Buddhism. And what church would we go to? You're damn right. I mean, where else could they go? Who else would have to, right? Yeah, and the third, I mean, if you take that blending, it's so neat to have had that background for me, because there are certain touchstones that overlap all of those faith, and it's here in the room today. I mean, it is a beautiful thing. Sorry to interrupt, but we're actually ahead of schedule, so I'm just going to free associate for a minute.
So I'm Steve O'Grady with the Orleans Conservation Trust, and I'm representing the Environmental Protection Group, which kind of morphed into more of a land protection group. So go through this kind of quickly here, but number one on our list was use less paper than the other groups. So we'd like to analyze the above-ground carbon storage trends on Cape Cod since about 2003, or the time period when high-resolution satellite imagery became available, and compare that to carbon emissions on the Cape, both natural and human sources during that same time period, and then look at what the overall potential of carbon storage on the Cape is in this landscape and our ecosystems here, to kind of frame the rest of our actions from here on out. I'll note here that Max was in our group, so. Number two is to coordinate regional efforts among land conservation organizations in relation to climate change goals, and to partner with towns in those goals. So I think there can be a more intentional dialogue between like organizations on the Cape with respect to these climate change efforts that sometimes take a backseat in some of our day-to-day activities. Number three, get environmental membership organizations to reach out to their members and to encourage them to get an energy audit or take other easy strides that will reduce their CO2 emissions. So we don't often have that conversation with our members. Our conversations with our members are about what activities we're up to, and at OCT or Chatham Conservation Foundation, we're not putting up solar panels on our office every day, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be encouraging our members to be more conservative in their own energy use. They all kind of mesh together. Number four, continue to preserve lands with a focus on lowland areas that will allow for salt marsh retreat and forested upland area conservation. One of the things we noticed is a lot of the conversations today have been mostly about reducing emissions, and as land conservation organizations, a lot of what we think about is how we can be more resilient to the inevitable change that's coming. Work towards making operations and facilities internally more or close to net zero, and work towards lower impact land management activities. And also as an internal action we could take, we were talking about divesting endowments from fossil fuels. And we had to include in here engaging youth and cultivating new leaders in this climate movement.